Hello and welcome to our next video at Games That Weren't, where today we'll be taking a look at more unseen materials from the archives of the late Archer Maclean. This includes a first ever look at Archer's abandoned Atari and Commodore sequel to Dropzone, a special Atari arcade version of the first game and early pre-release materials, international karate Atari prototypes and assets, and also various IK Plus graphical assets too. All of this has been made possible thanks to the generosity of Chris Wilkins of Fusion Retro Books, who has allowed Games That Weren't to preserve Archer's work and showcase materials from the archive for the first time. Everything shown today can be downloaded from the Games That Weren't archive, and a link can be found within the description. So let's kick things off. Here we have the very first glimpse of Dropzone 2 on the Atari and the Commodore 64, never seen before. Now, straight after the success of Dropzone, Archer had always intended to create a sequel, just to kind of build on the success of the first game, and this was done fairly quickly after the first game had been released. And this is something that Archer has talked about in numerous interviews, where he talks about the main protagonist being able to go into underground caves and exploring, possibly to kind of save men like he would have done in the first game. So here we can see a very early proof of concept where Archer was playing around, seeing how that might look. So we have like the main map on the top of the screen, and then also a scanner version of the map at the very bottom, indicating whereabouts you are in the cavern. And we assume there would have been different caverns and different levels to explore. Here we see like slight variation with some more embellishments, but also a different version of the scanner. So a much wider version and a much more narrower map overall. The final variation kind of shows a more cut down screen area, but also with like a score panel sort of added to the right hand side. So now we can see there's some kind of like fuel gauge or energy gauge, and also a lives counter or area as well. There's also what seems to be some kind of arrow indicator, perhaps indicating where you need to go on the map to maybe find something. The next screens then go into a bit more detail. So it seems that Archer had intended to have majority of like the background graphics based on the original game, but much more zoomed in. So here we can see sort of a tiny segment of that, and the next screen then adds some additional flourishes and improvements, including what seems to be the beginning of a Dropzone panel. The next screen is much more familiar and is like a zoomed in, more detailed version of the cavern like you see on the first game. Here is like a particular unfinished version, but as we go through we then start to see more details added. But then on the final version there's some fairly major changes, including the addition of the drop zone from the first game. So we're not entirely sure if this may have been the entrance to the cavern. So maybe there was some kind of a sequence that Archer had planned where you would be on the surface and you would have to kind of try and find the drop zone to enter the cavern and save your men. Unfortunately, we'll never get to know what Archer's original intentions were. And then at the very end, we then found some just very early test sprites. So it seems that Archer was looking to kind of switch away from a multicoloured sprite and to go down the high-res route to get more details. As you can see, he didn't get very far at all. There's just this very simple test that was done. And unfortunately, this was all that we found on the discs. We don't believe that Archer ever got to code anything. He just did those simple concepts before he then got dragged on probably either the rapid racing demo that he did, or working on international karate. Unfortunately, he never got to go back to it, maybe due to like the fallout that he had with US Gold due to royalties. We're not sure, but it's a very interesting glimpse of what his kind of vision and ideas would have been for the game, and I'm really pleased that we're able to find something of it. So next up is something rather interesting that we found on Archer's discs. Although it looks like a standard version of Dropzone, it's actually something which Archer had modified from the original code back in around early 1985. It all looks pretty much the same at this point, but when we go back to the title screen, then we can actually see a slight difference. So if you take a look at the bottom of the screen, by using a joystick in another port, you can actually add credits to the game before you can start. You can't start just by pressing the joystick button normally in the other port. Apart from that, the game seems to be exactly the same, but if there is anything that's different that you spot, then please do let us know. The only other thing that we have noticed is that if you leave the game running for a period of time, it now has an attract screen where you see the game very briefly being played. So I have some very vague recollections that Archer, even back in like the mid-80s, was looking to turn Dropzone into an arcade. And I'm not sure if he ever managed to do that, but it seems that his plan was to put an Atari 800 within a cabinet and have some kind of coin mechanism hooked up to the joystick port, which is quite a clever idea. And this is what he ended up producing for that purpose. So yeah, it's on the web page and you can download it for yourself and check it out. But I just thought it was very interesting. Again, if you do spot anything that's different within the main game itself, then please do let us know. Then we found a series of early Dropzone logos. So here we've got a very early one which Archer possibly just dropped in at the very beginning, followed by a slightly embossed version. But you'll agree that the final version that he came up with was certainly a lot more refined. And then finally we found this kind of very early moonscape, which we assume was done at the very beginning when Archer was testing out the scroll and just getting the basics together. So here we just have a very basic plain background with a few little rocks, and that's about it. And we assume that would have been used at the beginning and then later swapped in for the iconic sort of detailed caverns that he later did. So next up is a very early preview of International Karate on the Atari. I say very early, it's fairly complete. It's just lacking the sound, like the speech effects and the music, and there's kind of no titles or credits. So it goes straight in as soon as you run it into this automated demo, but you can start the game and play. It has a few of the backgrounds, not all of them. You can see here that part of the graphics are missing, so this is an earlier version of the background. And I don't think any of the bonus stages are present at this stage either. So you can download this for yourself. If you find any other differences that we haven't mentioned, again, please let us know. So our next Atari prototype is a lot more advanced. It has the proper credits, but there seems to be some corruption with the music. In addition to that, when you play the game, it kicks off straight away with no music playing and just has sound effects essentially. I think also there's still screens missing from it. I think the bonus scenes are actually present. I'm not sure if there's anything else in there. This could be very similar to the prototype that already exists online at the moment, so we've just included it within the archive anyway, just in case. There might be some sort of slight variations here that could be interesting to find and take a look at. So on Archer's discs there was an absolute ton of graphical images that were done in Atari's screen editor. So we're going to show you some of these now, and starting off with International Karate. And the first screen that you can see here seems to be possibly the earliest mock-up that Archer did for International Karate, showing a very rough background which got dropped for the final release and never finished off. And then just two slightly different fighters to kind of see how it would possibly look and how it could feel. Next up is then a background that was dropped from the final game and is known as Japanese Garden. So as you can see, it's clearly unfinished, but there were some like additional tree elements, and possibly it was dropped so they could sort of move away as much as possible from Way of the Exploding Fists, or it was down to space issues, I'm not sure. Then we seem to have like a version of the slates that you could smash during like a bonus game, but this time from like a side-on view, or more like a kind of a 2.5D view or something like that. So this was never used in the final version. Then we have some yin-yang symbols that don't seem to have been used at all, followed by some sprites in high res or some kind of mask, I'm not sure. Then there was some sort of background elements for possibly one of the maps that got used in the game, but there's like a wall element there which I don't think was used, and another segment as well. And then we start to get on to kind of various different sprites. So here we've got some fighters that look very different from what was used in the final version. This is then followed by much more familiar looking sprites, but with some rather odd looking legs there, as you can see. Then we have some falling down sprites. I think these were probably used in the final game, but we've just included it in case there's any frames there that might not have been used. I don't think that was used in the final game, I might be wrong, but again we've just included it just in case. Here we have two very different looking standing sprites, the one on the left looking slightly odd. And then here we seem to have like a test in terms of like sizing of the characters for the game. So on the right we have like the proper size like we did end up with, and on the left a slightly smaller variation. And interestingly, we've got the concepts that Archer was doing for the different judge sprites. So on the right we can see something close to what we ended up with in the final version, but on the left we have something fairly similar to what was actually used in Way of the Exploding Fist. And that's probably why, you know, those weren't used in the end, because it was maybe a bit too similar. And we ended up with the standing judge on the right hand side, and we've got like a few sort of speech bubble variations there as well, and differences. We then found a version of the logo. So the karate part is usually in high res on the title screen, so here it's in low res with some anti-aliasing. Then we have a slightly earlier version of one of the backgrounds with the clouds missing and not quite finished. Then we found sort of a kind of a mock-up or play around London level with the two characters in place. As you can see, the background's not quite finished. Followed by a very early version of one of the levels. So actually the Japanese tree I think is being used here, so maybe that's what the Japanese level actually evolved into, thinking about it. So a very different level with the Torii Gate. Then we've got the early beginnings of the sort of Sydney Harbour, just with the bridge drawn in at this stage. And then we're kind of back to the beginning. So then just something not produced in Screen Editor but found as an object file was this unused loading screen, which has the low res version of the logo but with a version of the Sydney Harbour graphic as part of the loading screen, and this wasn't used in the end. Instead, like a high res version I believe was used. I don't think this was used on the Atari version, but I apologise if I have got it wrong. Our final segment takes a look at a series of IK Plus graphics which were recovered from Archer's discs. IK Plus we don't believe ever had any plans for an Atari 8-bit version. However, Archer still did all of his coding and a lot of his graphical assets on the Atari. And this screen shows you a very early demonstration of the background. So you can see a much larger sunset and also the similar looking mountains at the side, but instead there's no kind of Torii Gate in sight, and there's like a large palm tree which is slightly off screen. We've also got Archer's name written there with like a shadow being cast from the sun, and then also the main fighters in different poses with the shadow also being cast. The next screen is much more similar to the final version and much closer, with the screen after that then adding in more elements, including those from the very first screen. This is followed by a slightly different variation of the sunset. Tucked away was also this digit character set, which no doubt was going to be used as part of the score panel, but it was very likely dropped as Archer was trying to save space and went for a much smaller character set overall. The next screen is particularly interesting. As many of you will recall, the bomb subgame never actually appeared in the 8-bit versions and only on the 16-bit versions. And I kind of naturally assumed it was just an additional flourish. But it's clear that Archer had intended to include that in the original 8-bit versions and perhaps run out of space. Here we can see the bomb sprites and with the different animations, but also we can see some very large elaborate explosion frames that were never used. This includes this explosion frame as well. It's a shame that it was never actually included because it was actually one of my favourite sub-games overall. But that was a lovely surprise to see. Then we go on to some like the animation frames, and here we've got like an unused explosion sequence from when possibly the main character gets blown up by the bomb and he turns into sort of a horrible mess. And this kind of reminds me a little bit of when you like get the bazooka in Gremlin Graphics' Death Wish game. If you shoot someone with that, they kind of turn into this just pile of mush, and that's kind of what that reminds me of. The next screen is a little less graphic and possibly a little bit more humorous, where if the bomb goes off, your trousers get singed and turn into ash. Then next up are a series of different suit designs, and my guess is that Archer was potentially looking at having the player choose at the very start what type of suit you could dress your player in. So maybe it would have been done as a first load and those sprites would have been then sort of loaded into the main game. I'm not sure. So in the end, Archer kind of went for something much more simplistic, where you just have like a white main sprite and then a red one for the second player, and of course the blue for the third. But it would have been quite interesting to see that checkered based one being used. But it would have been a heck of a lot of animation frames that Archer would have had to have updated. The next frame after that shows more of the sprites together, but then including the sleeveless sprites at the top, which I think Archer was doing for like a US version of the game, which never got used in the end. So the C64 prototypes of those we recovered last year, but they're unfortunately quite glitchy. The very first sprite though, you can see there's like a variation where the trouser legs are a lot shorter. We then found these judge sort of animation frames and a toe tapping animation that were never used in the final game. So in the Commodore 64 version, the main judge is fairly static apart from the speech bubble. But here we've got like frames for when he's speaking to you, and the toe tapping animation possibly when he's being impatient or waiting for you to do something. So these were never used in the end. I think there was animations actually added to the 16-bit versions. So possibly these were just dropped due to space issues. We then have a series of frames which don't seem to have been used in the final game. So we have this one particular frame here which doesn't look very familiar. There might be some that have been used, and I apologise if I have mixed any in. But then we got this particular move which seems to have been completely dropped. And then a elbow move which I'm not sure if that's 100% finished. Followed by one where the fighter is kind of collapsed on the floor, possibly from like a particular move or maybe from one of the bomb explosions or something. And then there's a couple more frames which I don't believe were used in the final game. Please do correct me if I'm wrong. And then just some different stances, which I think these ones probably were used. They do look familiar. Then there's what seems to be a different backflip animation. And possibly like a forward roll animation that was never used. Certainly don't recall seeing anything like that in the final game. And then something which looks like the crane kick from the Karate Kid, which would have been very cool if they'd managed to implement that. What seems to be a sort of another roll variation. And then the splits move is present in the game. There might be a couple of frames in the bottom corner that were actually dropped. And then again, we've got another very different version of the fighter, so with the slightly smaller sprite and a couple of test moves. Then some more moves and frames which seem to have been dropped, including, rather oddly, a very odd looking version of the fighter on the end. And some more sort of twisting moves there by the looks of it. The following set of sprites were used in the final game, but these particular versions are the sleeveless versions of the fighters, so I just thought I'd include them just so you can see them in full, because in the C64 prototype that we saved, it is quite glitchy and hasn't actually been fixed yet, unfortunately. So here we can see like the falling down with the sleeveless version, also one where you've been hit. I'm not entirely sure if that sort of hit animation is actually in the final game or not. I'll have to double check. And then finally the bit where the main sprite is fallen down. And there we have it. That concludes our look at a series of different Atari assets and prototypes that we managed to find on Archer's discs, and I really hope that you've enjoyed the video. Again, it is a huge thank you to Chris Wilkins of Fusion Retro Books for allowing us to kind of preserve all of this material and to showcase it with you. Also, thank you to Alan Hamilton for his original help with various bits of hardware to preserve some of the discs, and also Matt Allen as well for lending his flippy disk drive to back up some of the Atari discs. Yeah, hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one. And yeah, have a great time and speak to you soon. Take care.